I still remember the night my marriage ended. It wasn't with shouting, plates breaking, or storming out. It was with 5 cold words, spoken as casually as if he were ordering takeout. I'm done. I want a divorce. My hand trembled, and the glass of red wine I had been holding slipped from my fingers. It shattered on the tiled floor, crimson liquid spreading like blood across the white surface. I just stood there, frozen, watching the stain bloom, while the man I had devoted 17 years of my life to calmly folded his arms. 17 years, gone in 12 minutes, wrapped up as neatly as one of Eric's business contracts. Before diving deeper into today's dramatic journey, take a moment to subscribe to her betrayal stories and turn on the notification bell. This channel is where you'll always discover powerful tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and unexpected twists. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. Perhaps the next story will echo something you've lived through yourself. The night my marriage ended, it wasn't with shouting or slammed doors. It was with silence. Eric Collins slid the divorce papers across the counter, his pen scratching my name into history's footnote. My fingers trembled as I signed, still sticky from the red wine I had spilled moments earlier. The stain bled across the white tablecloth like a wound. An omen, perhaps, of the life that was about to bleed out from under me. When I looked up, he was already removing his wedding ring. He placed it gently on the porcelain sink, as casually as a man setting down his car keys. And then he walked away. No glance back, no hesitation, just the quiet efficiency of a man closing a file he no longer needed. 17 years, ended in less than 17 minutes. I didn't cry. Not then. My voice barely whispered, "So this is how it ends." But endings, I would later learn, are only illusions. What looks like an ending can be the beginning of something else, something far sharper, far stronger. If you've ever been the woman who carried the invisible weight of a household, you'll understand me. For 17 years, I was flawless in my role. I planned birthdays and anniversaries, kept his shirts pressed for board meetings, made sure his partner's wives received thoughtful gifts. I raised our daughter, managed our home, and cheered every one of his successes from the shadows. And every time Eric succeeded, he smiled for the cameras, shook hands with his investors, and preached about being a self-made man. Self-made, as if I didn't exist. To him, my sacrifices were invisible. Worse, I was invisible. "You don't understand business," he'd say with that thin smile whenever I asked about his company. "Stay in your lane, Laura." If you've ever heard words like that from someone you loved, you know they don't just sting. They strip away your dignity thread by thread, until one day you realize there's almost nothing left. The cracks had begun long before the papers. One afternoon, while tidying his home office, I found his laptop open. Normally, Eric was meticulous. He locked every device, guarded every password like state secrets. But that day, maybe fate was on my side. There it was. An email. Not business, not strategy, but laughter, private jokes, and promises of midnight meetings. The sender, Madison Lee, his secretary. She used his corporate email, the same one tied to quarterly reports and investor updates, to write lines like, "I can't wait until it's just us. No more hiding." He allowed it. He welcomed it. I closed the laptop slowly, my heart pounding. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation. But betrayal has layers, and Eric knew how to twist the knife. Margaret Collins, his late mother, had left behind a family heirloom, a gold ring set with a single sapphire, passed from one Collins wife to another. It wasn't just jewelry. It was legacy. Years ago, when I asked Eric about it, he said it had been lost. Stolen, perhaps. Gone forever. But it wasn't lost. It wasn't stolen. Months before he spoke the word divorce, he gave it to Madison. That ring, meant for the wife of the Collins heir, slipped onto her finger as if erasing me entirely. Do you know what it feels like to be replaced not just in your husband's heart, but in your mother-in-law's memory? To be erased from the lineage of a family you had served faithfully for almost 2 decades. It burns, and that fire, once lit, does not die quietly. There was one man, though, who saw me. Who knew? Richard Collins, Eric's father. He wasn't perfect, but he valued integrity above wealth. One night, after a gala where Eric paraded Madison like a prize mare, Richard pulled me aside. His hands trembled, his voice low but furious. "Laura, my son doesn't deserve you. Money without respect is worthless. A family name means nothing if it isn't built on integrity. One day, Eric will learn that lesson." I didn't know then how prophetic those words would become. They lodged themselves in my memory, quiet embers waiting for the right gust of wind. The final cut wasn't private, it was public. Weeks after the divorce, Eric and Madison held hands on the very beach where he and I had once exchanged vows. Malibu, under the same stretch of sky, with the same band that had played at our wedding. He didn't even bother choosing something different. He recreated our day with her. Imagine standing in the shadows, watching the man you built a life with flaunt his mistress in your wedding's echo. Imagine the humiliation, the audacity, the cruelty of it. I didn't cry that night either. Instead, I made a decision. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would not fight on his terms. I would wait. And when the moment was right, I would end his story not with rage, but with truth. That night, after cleaning the shards of broken glass from the floor, I took the ring he left on the sink and placed it inside a small velvet box. The box was light, but in my hands it felt heavy. Heavy with betrayal. Heavy with silence. Heavy with memory. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. I was no longer the woman who ironed his shirts and planned his dinners. I was the woman he underestimated. The woman he erased. And women like me, we don't stay erased for long. Because betrayal always leaves a trail, and trails always lead to truth. Eric thought he was free. He thought he had replaced me, rewritten me, erased me. But he was wrong. What he didn't know was that his own father had written a final chapter. And when the day came, that chapter would ruin him, in front of everyone. If you were in my place, 17 years of sacrifice discarded in 17 minutes, what would you have done? Would you fight back immediately? Or would you wait in silence, letting the betrayer dig his own grave? Share your thoughts. I want to know how you see it. After the divorce papers were signed, Eric didn't retreat into shame. He strutted into the world with Madison Lee, his secretary, his mistress, his new prize, dangling from his arm like she was jewelry he'd just purchased. At charity galas, at business luncheons, even in the pews of Sunday service, he flaunted her. Neighbors whispered. Women at church gave me those long, pitying glances. Strangers at the grocery store offered sympathetic nods as though I were a widow instead of a discarded wife. I smiled through it all. Not because I was strong, because I was silent. And silence, when held long enough, is not weakness. It is a seed. And mine was beginning to grow. One evening, I was invited, or perhaps summoned, to a Collins family dinner. Richard, Eric's father, wanted to see me. He had grown frail since Margaret's passing, his hands thinner, his voice softer, but his eyes still sharp as steel. The dining room, once glowing with laughter and Margaret's cooking, had turned frigid. Candles flickered on polished mahogany, but the warmth was gone. Madison sat beside Eric like a queen at her coronation, a smug smile fixed on her lips. On her hand glittered Margaret's sapphire heirloom ring. My ring, the one Eric had sworn was lost. My breath caught. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I said nothing. Robert Lee, Madison's uncle and Eric's business partner, clinked his glass. His words sliced through the air. To Eric and Madison, a future built on ambition, not sentimentality. The laughter that followed echoed off the crystal, but I wasn't listening to them. I was watching Richard. His hand trembled as he set down his fork. His jaw tightened, his eyes clouded with quiet rage. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than the toast. Mini cliffhanger. That night, I realized I wasn't the only one who saw through Eric's show. Days later, I returned to the old house to collect belongings. The smell of his cologne still lingered, sharp and invasive. Eric was pacing in the living room, phone in hand, irritation etched into every line of his face. "You should have moved out faster," he snapped, not even looking at me. "You're useless now. Just take your things and leave." The words hit harder than the divorce itself. Useless. If you've ever been told you are nothing by someone you gave your life to, you know how those syllables echo in your bones. But here's what Eric never understood. Cruelty exposes weakness. In that flash of arrogance, I saw something else flicker in his eyes. Fear. Fear that I might not be as broken as he needed me to be. And in that moment, I made a silent promise. You will regret underestimating me. Weeks later, the invitation arrived, not to me, but to the entire city. Eric and Madison's engagement party. The venue, Malibu Beach, the very stretch of sand where Eric had once sworn eternal love to me. The music? The same band that had played at our wedding 17 years earlier. I stood in the shadows, listening as those familiar melodies, our melodies, now played for another woman. The cruelty was calculated, almost theatrical. Every choice was a blade sharpened to cut me deeper. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I memorized everything. The champagne towers glinting in the sunset, Madison's dress catching the sea breeze, Eric's hand on her waist as though I had never existed. Every detail became fuel, because the best revenge isn't loud, it is patient, it is meticulous, it is devastating. Mini cliffhanger. And that night on Malibu's golden sand, my silence hardened into strategy. In the chaos, Richard became my unexpected ally. He invited me to tea one afternoon. His frame was weaker, his voice slower, but his words carried weight. "Laura," he said, his eyes burning into mine, "I've watched you carry this family without recognition. I cannot undo my son's foolishness, but I can make sure you are not left with nothing." He didn't elaborate, but he hinted at a document. Something sealed, something waiting. My heart pounded. A will? A letter? Richard had always valued integrity over wealth. If he said there was something for me, I believed him. Not long after, while clearing out Eric's old office, I stumbled on a locked drawer. With effort, I pried it open. Inside, between contracts and memos, lay a folded letter in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. The words burned off the page. "Eric, your treatment of Laura dishonors this family. If you cannot respect her, you will not inherit what I've built." My hands shook as I pressed the paper to my chest. It wasn't a final will, but it was proof. Proof that Richard saw me, that my suffering had not gone unnoticed. For the first time in months, I felt something close to power. Mini cliffhanger. And power, once tasted, is impossible to forget. But Eric and Madison weren't finished. They waged war in whispers. "She's unstable," Madison sneered to anyone who would listen. "She begged me not to leave," Eric confided to mutual friends, feigning pity. "She can't survive without me." Every rumor, every insult was another stone in the wall I was building inside myself. Not a wall of weakness, a wall of resilience. One day that wall would fall, not on me, but on them. Small velvet box. Inside lay the wedding ring Eric had left on the sink, abandoned like me. I held it up to the lamplight. The gold glinted, a relic of promises broken. But in my hands, it was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a weapon. Because what Eric and Madison didn't know was this: I wasn't coming to their celebration as a ghost of the past. I was coming with secrets, with evidence, with truth sharp enough to cut through their empire. And when the moment was right, the empire they had built on lies would crumble, piece by piece, in front of everyone. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, watching your ex flaunt his mistress with your wedding band's music playing in the background, would you walk away quietly, or would you plot your return, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? People assume the loudest voice in the room is the most dangerous, the one who shouts, curses, slams fists on tables. But they're wrong. The most dangerous person is the one who says nothing, the one who watches, who waits, who remembers. And that, finally, was me. After that humiliating family dinner and Eric's gaudy engagement announcement, I stopped drowning in self-pity. The grief hadn't vanished, but I refused to let it rot me from the inside. I turned inward, to my house, to the walls that once echoed with his footsteps and the sickly sweet trace of Madison's perfume. That house had been a mausoleum of what I'd lost. I refused to let it stay that way, so I began stripping away everything Eric had touched. The sterile whites he loved became warm shades of amber and cream. The cold, steel furniture he insisted on was replaced with pieces that felt lived in, with curves, with comfort. It wasn't redecorating, it was resurrection. Each brushstroke of paint whispered a vow: I am not finished. I am rebuilding. When a friend stopped by, she looked around in wonder. "This doesn't look like Eric's house anymore," she said. I smiled. "That's because it's mine now." One rainy afternoon, I found myself in Eric's abandoned office sorting through boxes. A locked drawer caught my eye. It mocked me, one last secret hidden in the bones of his empire. With a hairpin and stubborn patience, I pried it open. Inside lay contracts, old correspondence, and one folded document sealed with Richard's steady hand. I unfolded it, and the words seared into me like fire. In the event that my son, Eric Collins, should dissolve his marriage to Laura Bennett without cause of her unfaithfulness, he forfeits his right to a portion of my estate. Said portion, totaling $23 million, shall instead be redirected at my discretion. $23 million. Not just wealth. Power. My knees buckled and I sank into the leather chair. My hands trembled, pressing the paper against my chest. Richard, stern, unyielding Richard, had seen me all along. He had known his son's arrogance would one day demand consequences. "Thank you, Richard," I whispered into the empty room. For the first time in months, the balance tilted in my favor. Mini cliffhanger. At that moment, I stopped being the discarded wife. I became the keeper of his downfall. Days later, I reached out to Patricia Miller, Richard's sister. She had always been kind but cautious, orbiting far outside Eric's ruthless world. Over tea, I asked carefully, "Patricia, do you remember Margaret's sapphire ring?" Her brow furrowed. "Of course. Your mother-in-law wore it every Sunday." "Why?" "Eric told me it was lost." Her voice sharpened, steady as steel. It wasn't lost, Laura. I have a photo from my birthday. Margaret is wearing it. The next morning, her email arrived. I opened the attachment, and there was Margaret. Radiant, smiling, the sapphire catching the light on her finger. Proof. Not just of Eric's lies, but of Madison's audacity to flaunt what never belonged to her. Proof I could one day lay bare. The night before the engagement party, I gathered my arsenal. On the table lay 3 items: Eric's wedding ring, abandoned on the sink the night he discarded me; the photograph of Margaret, sapphire blazing on her hand; Richard's sealed letter, a document heavy enough to fracture an empire. Individually, they were relics of pain. Together, they were a weapon sharp enough to cut through Eric's lies. I placed the ring on a chain and slipped it around my neck. The letter slid into a golden envelope. The photo folded neatly inside my clutch. I stared at them, my hands steady now. For months, I had been drowning. Tonight, I was swimming toward shore, with fire in my chest. Eric must have sensed the shift. 2 nights before the party, my phone rang. His voice still carried that old command, the tone he once used when he expected me to obey without question. "Laura," he said coldly, "don't embarrass yourself by showing up. This is my future, not yours. Stay away." I almost laughed. He wasn't warning me for my sake. He was pleading for his. Because men like Eric don't fear shouting. They fear silence. They fear the woman they underestimated might have something left to say. Mini cliffhanger. And I did. That evening, I lit a candle beside Margaret's photo on the mantel. I spoke to her as though she could hear me. "You raised a man who forgot love, Margaret. But you also raised a husband who chose integrity. Richard saw me. He knew. And now, I won't let your ring be worn by someone who mocked your family name." Tears slid down my face. Not weakness, resolve. They glistened in the candlelight like armor, not surrender. The morning of the engagement party, I slipped into a white dress. Not bridal white, but deliberate, symbolic. The fabric was simple, elegant, strong. I clasped the chain around my neck, Eric's abandoned ring resting against my collarbone like a reminder. I tucked the golden envelope with Richard's letter into my clutch, alongside Margaret's photograph. Then I stood before the mirror. Gone was the invisible wife who ironed his shirts and kept his dinner warm. Staring back at me was a woman armed with truth, cloaked in dignity, sharpened by betrayal. I touched the glass, whispering, "Tonight, the lies end." And for the first time in a long time, I believed myself. So tell me, if you were holding a letter worth $23 million, a photograph that could unravel an engagement, and a ring that carried 17 years of betrayal, would you strike immediately, or would you wait for the perfect moment, letting the truth explode on its own? Share your thoughts. I want to know how you'd carry that power. The Malibu sun was setting in streaks of gold and crimson the evening I arrived at their engagement party. From the cliffside, I could hear music floating over the ocean breeze, the same band that had played at my wedding 17 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I stepped onto the sand, whispers followed. Some recognized me immediately, the discarded wife, the ghost of Eric's past. They expected me to look broken. Instead, I stood tall, my white dress catching the last rays of daylight, a golden envelope tucked firmly in my clutch. The stage was set like a cruel parody of my past life. White tents lined the beach, champagne flowed endlessly, and Madison glowed in a fitted gown, Margaret's sapphire ring glittering on her hand. Eric, smug and polished, kept one arm around her waist as photographers snapped away. To love, to ambition, and to a future brighter than the past, Robert Lee toasted, his voice booming over the speakers. The crowd erupted in applause. I waited until the clinking of glasses subsided. Then I stepped forward. The music faltered when people noticed me. Conversations hushed. Madison's laughter froze mid-air. Eric's jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed something more. Fear. "Laura?" someone whispered. "What is she doing here?" I walked slowly, deliberately, through the sea of shocked faces until I stood before the stage. The ocean roared behind me like an ally. "I won't take much of your time," I began, my voice calm but cutting through the silence. "But since this celebration involves family, it's only right that truth has a seat at the table." My gaze fell on Madison's hand. "That ring you're wearing," I said, tilting my head slightly, "isn't yours to flaunt. It belonged to Margaret Collins, Eric's mother, a family heirloom." Madison scoffed. "Eric gave it to me. It's ours." I pulled a folded photo from my clutch and held it high. "Funny, because here's Margaret wearing it at Patricia Miller's birthday. Patricia sent me this herself." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Patricia, standing near the front, nodded firmly, confirming the truth. Madison's face drained of color. "That ring," I continued, "was never lost. Eric lied to me, and he gave it away to a woman who thought she could steal not just jewelry, but legacy." The murmurs turned into condemnation. Madison tried to cover her hand, but it was too late. The image was burned into everyone's eyes. Eric stepped forward, his voice low, dangerous. "Laura, enough. Leave." I met his gaze with steel. "No, Eric. You're the one who should be leaving." I pulled the golden envelope from my clutch and held it aloft. Richard Collins left behind more than a name. He left conditions. Legal, binding conditions. The crowd leaned closer. Robert Lee shifted uncomfortably. Madison's nails dug into Eric's arm. I unfolded the letter, my voice unwavering as I read. "In the event that my son, Eric Collins, should dissolve his marriage to Laura Bennett without cause of her unfaithfulness, he forfeits his right to a portion of my estate. Said portion, totaling $23 million, shall instead be redirected." The silence that followed was deafening. Only the waves dared to make noise. Madison shrieked, "You're lying! This can't be real!" But before the crowd could spiral into confusion, I reached into my clutch once more and pulled out my phone. With a tap, Richard's voice filled the speakers, his words recorded in his own gravelly timbre. "Laura has carried this family with grace and sacrifice. If Eric abandons her, he abandons the fortune I built. The money will follow integrity, not arrogance." The recording ended. The crowd stood frozen, 200 witnesses to Eric's undoing. Eric's face turned chalk white. His hands shook as the implications sank in. $23 million, gone in a single stroke of his father's pen. Madison spun on him, her voice shrill. "You knew about this. You told me everything was secure. Do you realize what you've done?" Her voice cracked into hysteria. She ripped the sapphire ring from her finger and hurled it at his chest. "You're nothing without that money. Nothing." The ring clattered onto the stage, rolling until it stopped at my feet. I bent down, picked it up, and slipped it into my clutch. "Correction," I said softly but firmly. "You're trespassing." Robert Lee tried to step in, his face red with embarrassment. "This is a private matter." "No," I cut him off, my voice rising for the first time. "This is a matter of legacy, of truth, of betrayal witnessed by every person standing here tonight. And let the record show, Eric Collins is no longer heir to his father's estate." Gasps, whispers. Phones lifted, recording every word. There would be no covering this up. Eric's lips moved, but no sound came out. For once, the man who always had a speech, a strategy, a smirk, was speechless. I turned to the crowd, my chest rising with a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. 17 years of silence end tonight. Integrity isn't measured in titles, in money, or in rings. It's measured in love, in sacrifice, and in respect. And respect can't be stolen. It must be earned. The crowd erupted, not in applause but in murmurs of approval, heads nodding, eyes fixed on me with newfound respect. I stepped down from the stage, my heels sinking softly into the sand, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. As I passed Eric, I paused. I looked him dead in the eye and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "This villa, this legacy, they were never yours. And now, neither am I." I walked away from the chaos, the band stuttering into silence, the party unraveling behind me. My clutch was heavier now, with truth, with justice, with dignity restored. And as the ocean breeze wrapped around me, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't about destroying him. It was about reclaiming me. If you were standing on that beach, with every eye on you, would you have had the courage to expose the truth? Or would you have walked away quietly, keeping the secret to yourself? Share your thoughts. I want to know how you'd face that moment. The morning after the engagement party, headlines splashed across local papers and online news. Eric Collins humiliated at Malibu gala, $23 million clause exposed. Heir disinherited after wife's stunning revelation. For once, I wasn't invisible. But it wasn't fame I wanted. It was freedom. In the weeks that followed, Eric's empire began to crumble. Investors lost faith, deals evaporated, board members whispered about his reckless arrogance, and Robert Lee, the man who had toasted ambition over sentimentality, suddenly found his own reputation under scrutiny for ignoring Richard's conditions. Madison, once radiant with confidence, disappeared from public view. Rumors spread that she had left Eric after the truth came out, screaming about wasted years and a future built on lies. Eric tried to fight. He called lawyers, demanded loopholes, tried to twist Richard's words. But Richard had been precise. The clause was airtight. The $23 million was redirected to the Eleanor Collins Cancer Foundation, a charity named after Eric's late mother. The irony was perfect. The money he craved went not to him, but to a cause rooted in compassion and dignity, the very values he had abandoned. One rainy afternoon, Eric found me at a quiet cafe where I often wrote in my journal. He looked older, his eyes sunken, his tailored suit now rumpled. He placed something on the table. His wedding ring. The one he had left by the sink the night he ended our marriage. "This belongs to you, not me," he whispered. I studied the ring for a long moment. Then I pushed it back toward him. "No, Eric. It belongs to no one now. Let it stay where it was meant to be. Finished." I stood, leaving him alone with the symbol of what he had thrown away. Walking out of that cafe, I felt the circle close. Back at my house, I opened the velvet box where I had kept relics of my old life. Eric's ring was gone, but Richard's letter, Margaret's photo, and the sapphire ring remained. I didn't keep them as trophies. I kept them as reminders. That silence has power. That legacy belongs to those who honor it. That even the invisible wife can become the voice of justice. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like freedom. One evening, my sister Jennifer stopped by with a bottle of wine. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're stronger than you know, Laura." We sat by the fireplace, laughing for the first time in months. You taught me something, she said softly. That respect isn't something we beg for. It's something we demand by living with dignity. Her words echoed in my heart. Because in the end, my story wasn't just about Eric. It was about every woman who has ever been discarded, overlooked, or silenced. Sometimes I wonder if Eric ever truly loved me, or if I was simply another investment in his portfolio of success. But I no longer dwell on that question, because love that comes with conditions isn't love, it's control. And I have learned to release control. As I sip tea by my window watching the garden bloom, I think of Richard's voice on that recording. The money will follow integrity, not arrogance. He was right. And integrity isn't just about money. It's about living in a way that cannot be bought or stolen. To the women watching my story, I say this. If you've ever been told you are useless, remember, your worth is not measured by another's recognition. If you've ever been betrayed, remember, betrayal is not the end of your story, but the beginning of your strength. Eric thought my silence meant weakness. He didn't understand that silence was my strategy, and when the time was right, truth became my weapon. Now, when people ask about my marriage, I smile gently and say, it ended with 5 words, but my life began again with 3. I am free. And freedom, I've learned, is the greatest inheritance of all. If you've ever carried invisible burdens in your family, if you've ever been pushed aside or underestimated, what gave you the strength to rise again? Share your story in the comments, because here, every story is a reminder that no one suffers alone. Together, we raise our voices for justice, respect, and healing. And if this story touched you, don't forget, subscribe to her betrayal stories and turn on the notification bell. More stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and shocking twists await you. Stories that remind us all of the power of dignity, justice, and truth.